The line of cars barely moved. Parents were double parked, hazard lights blinking, kids hopping out with backpacks half-zipped while crossing between bumpers like nobody had ever heard the phrase moving traffic. One SUV slid halfway into the crosswalk because the driver was only stopping for a second. Another parent waved 3 cars around them like they personally controlled the intersection. Then the blue lights came on. Not behind the speeding car, not behind the distracted teenager. Behind the parent who thought school drop-off rules were optional because everyone else was doing the same thing. And the worst part? The driver genuinely looked shocked. Have you ever been stopped by police during a school drop-off, pickup line or school zone situation where you honestly thought what you were doing wasn't a big deal? Tell me what happened in the comments, because a lot of drivers don't realize how fast these situations escalate once an officer starts viewing the stop as more than just traffic. Stick around because later I'm going to explain one tiny mistake people make during school zone stops that completely changes how officers interpret the entire interaction, and most drivers never even realize they did it. Here's the thing people forget about school drop-off areas. Officers don't view them the same way they view ordinary traffic violations. They don't. Mentally, they treat these zones differently because children are involved, unpredictable movement is involved, crossing guards are involved, and emotions are already high before police even arrive. Parents are late, kids are distracted, school staff are frustrated, buses are squeezing through narrow lanes while dozens of drivers suddenly start improvising their own traffic patterns. That matters because the officer walking up to your window is already entering the stop with a heightened safety mindset. And drivers miss that completely. A lot of people think, well, I wasn't speeding. But school zone enforcement isn't only about speed. It's about chaos management. Officers are watching for impatience, illegal turns, blocked crosswalks, phone use, failure to obey crossing guards, stopping in fire lanes, illegal U-turns, passing stopped buses, parking where visibility is obstructed, and drivers trying to invent shortcuts because the drop-off line is inconvenient. What makes these stops so interesting from a bodycam perspective is how quickly normal people start rationalizing behavior the second they see lights behind them. I was just dropping my kid off. Everybody does it. I was only there for 10 seconds. There wasn't even anybody crossing. I didn't see the sign. Some of those explanations might even be true, but from the officer's perspective, they've probably watched 20 near misses that morning alone. They've seen parents back into children. They've seen impatient drivers swing around buses. They've seen arguments between adults in front of schools. So when they approach your vehicle, they're often less interested in hearing your reasoning than drivers expect. And this is where people start making mistakes. The first mistake is talking too much too early. You'd be surprised how many drivers turn a simple school zone stop into a deeper investigation because they start nervously over-explaining things before the officer even asks a real question. Sorry officer, I'm late, my son forgot his lunch. I was checking my GPS. I know I cut across, but everyone was stopped anyway. Now the officer is hearing distraction, maybe phone use, maybe inattentive driving, maybe admissions, maybe nervous behavior. People think nervous talking makes them seem cooperative. Sometimes it does the opposite, and officers absolutely watch body language during school zone stops because emotions run high there. They're observing whether your hands are shaking, whether you're looking around constantly, whether passengers are suddenly silent, whether someone in the back seat starts hiding something, whether you're aggressively defensive, whether you immediately challenge authority, whether you refuse eye contact, or whether your story keeps changing. You have to remember something uncomfortable but true. Officers are trained to notice deviations from what they consider normal behavior. That doesn't mean nervousness equals guilt. Plenty of innocent people get nervous around police, but officers still factor it into their decision-making process because they're trying to assess risk in real time. And school environments increase that sensitivity dramatically. Now let's talk about one situation that happens constantly during drop-off enforcement. The illegal quick stop. This is where a driver stops somewhere they absolutely should not stop, but mentally justifies it because they believe the stop is temporary enough not to count. Half on the curb, blocking a driveway, sitting in a bike lane, stopped beside parked cars, hovering in a no-stopping zone with hazards on. Parents do this constantly. And many genuinely believe hazard lights somehow create temporary legal immunity. They don't. Hazard lights are not a magical "I can ignore traffic laws for 30 seconds" button. But culturally, drivers have started treating them that way. Officers know this too, which is why some become extremely aggressive about school zone enforcement. They're tired of hearing, "I was just," attached to dangerous behavior. "I was just letting my daughter out. I was just checking if my son forgot his backpack. I was just waiting for traffic." The problem is children are unpredictable. Kids dart between cars. They run behind SUVs. They cross without looking. And officers know a vehicle stopped illegally for just 5 seconds can create a blind spot that causes a tragedy. That's why some school zone stops escalate emotionally faster than ordinary traffic stops. The driver sees inconvenience. The officer sees potential catastrophe. Those are two completely different mental frameworks colliding at your driver's side window. And here's another thing body cam footage reveals over and over again. Drivers often become argumentative not because they believe they're legally correct, but because they feel morally justified. That distinction matters. A parent might think, "I'm taking care of my child, obviously that matters more than a painted curb." But the officer is thinking, "The rules exist specifically because everyone thinks their own child-related emergency deserves an exception." That's why arguing fairness rarely works during these stops. Now let's talk about repeated questioning, because this is where tension starts creeping into these interactions. An officer asks, "Why'd you stop there?" You answer. Then they ask again slightly differently. "So you didn't see the no stopping sign?" You answer again. Then another version comes. "You drive through here every morning?" People start getting irritated because they think, "I already answered that." But officers often repeat questions to compare consistency, tone, timing, and confidence. They're looking for contradictions. They're looking for hesitation. They're trying to determine whether this is simple carelessness or whether something else is happening. Maybe distracted driving, maybe impairment, maybe concealed criminal activity unrelated to the original stop. And yes, that happens more often than people think. Plenty of arrests start with school zone violations that lead officers toward entirely separate issues. Expired licenses, warrants, open containers, drug possession, outstanding court issues, illegal firearms, probation violations. The original reason for the stop is sometimes just the doorway. That's why experienced officers often stay conversational at first. They're gathering information while appearing casual. "How's your morning going? You headed to work after this? You live around here?" People answer automatically because it sounds friendly. But every answer is also information gathering. And here's where people misunderstand their rights in a dangerous way. A lot of online advice tells drivers to become instantly confrontational the second police start asking questions beyond identification. That approach can backfire badly during school zone stops because the environment is already tense and public. Kids are nearby, parents are watching, school staff are observing, officers are aware cameras may be rolling. Tone matters enormously. You can assert rights without sounding combative. That balance is critical, because once an officer perceives hostility, disrespect, or escalating resistance, the interaction often changes psychologically. Their posture changes, their patience changes, their suspicion level changes. And drivers accidentally trigger this shift all the time with sarcasm. "Oh, so now dropping kids off is illegal? Guess solving real crimes can wait. You people sit here every morning just to write tickets?" That kind of commentary almost never helps. In fact, it often extends the stop because now the officer's attention shifts from resolving the violation to managing attitude and control of the encounter. People underestimate how much emotional dynamics shape roadside interactions. Now let's get into one of the most misunderstood moments during traffic stops: silence. There's this myth online that the second you stop talking, officers immediately give up and walk away. That is not how real stops work. Sometimes silence increases officer curiosity, especially if your behavior before becoming silent appeared nervous, inconsistent, or defensive. Imagine this sequence. Officer approaches. You rapidly explain everything. You contradict yourself once. Then suddenly you go completely silent after remembering internet advice videos. That abrupt behavioral shift itself becomes noticeable. Officers are human observers. They notice changes in confidence and communication patterns. And during school zone stops, officers are often already watching for signs of distracted driving because phone use around schools is such a major issue now. Watch bodycam footage long enough and you'll notice how often officers stare into vehicles before even speaking. They're checking seatbelts, looking for phones, observing passenger movement, seeing whether documents are already prepared, or whether someone starts frantically digging around. And frantic movement creates problems. One of the fastest ways to raise tension during a stop is reaching around unpredictably without explaining what you're doing, especially in SUVs or minivans where visibility is limited. An officer asks for license and registration. Driver immediately leans toward center console, then reaches behind seat, then opens glove compartment aggressively, then starts turning around toward the back seat. The officer has no idea what's happening in that moment. People forget officers approach vehicles with incomplete information. They don't know whether they're dealing with a stressed parent, an exhausted commuter, someone carrying a weapon legally, someone carrying one illegally, or someone panicking for unrelated reasons. That uncertainty affects every instruction they give. Now let's talk about passengers, because school drop situations often involve multiple people in the vehicle. Kids in the back, another parent, teenagers, sometimes grandparents. Passengers can unintentionally make everything worse. A teenager mutters something sarcastic. A passenger starts arguing from the back seat. Someone interrupts repeatedly. Somebody records while narrating aggressively. And suddenly a simple stop becomes emotionally crowded. Officers often react strongly when multiple voices start entering the interaction because control begins slipping away. The stop becomes harder to manage safely. And then there's the emotional pressure children create. This changes everything. Parents hate being questioned in front of their kids. Officers know that. Kids become scared. Some start crying. Parents become embarrassed and defensive because other parents are watching from nearby vehicles. That embarrassment causes people to rush decisions. They interrupt more. They argue faster. They stop listening carefully. And officers pick up on emotional escalation almost immediately. One thing drivers rarely understand is how much officers evaluate compliance through pacing and demeanor, not just words. You can technically comply while still signaling resistance through tone, delay, gestures, or attitude. For example, "Can I see your license?" Long silence, heavy sigh, slow movements, eye roll. "Yeah, hold on." Technically compliant? Sure. But emotionally confrontational? Absolutely. Officers notice that instantly. And here's where the stop can unexpectedly expand. An officer who initially intended to issue a warning may start reassessing the interaction entirely based on behavior alone. Not necessarily because the violation became more severe, but because the officer now anticipates future resistance. That psychological shift matters. People think officers only react to laws being broken. In reality, they also react to uncertainty, unpredictability, perceived disrespect, and perceived safety concerns. Now let's discuss document retention, because this frustrates drivers constantly. A lot of people ask, why are they still holding my license? Why haven't they given my documents back? Legally and practically, retaining documents during an active stop is part of maintaining the detention while records checks occur. But psychologically, drivers experience this differently. They feel trapped in limbo, and the longer the stop goes, the more tension builds. Especially when the officer disappears back to the patrol car for what feels like forever. Inside your vehicle, your imagination starts working. Are they running warrants? Did something come back? Why are there two officers now? Why are they looking into my back seat? Meanwhile, officers may simply be checking registration issues, prior warnings, warrants, suspended license databases, insurance status, or school zone enforcement records. But silence during delays makes people nervous. Then comes another common mistake. Drivers begin rehearsing speeches before the officer returns. "I'm not admitting guilt. I know my rights. I pay taxes. I wasn't even speeding." And by the time the officer approaches again, the driver is emotionally primed for conflict even if the officer is simply returning documents. Bodycam footage captures this all the time. Officers walk up calmly while drivers are internally preparing for battle. Now let's talk about one tactic officers sometimes use that confuses people badly during school-related stops: the conversational reset. This is where an officer returns after a long pause and suddenly changes tone completely. Earlier they were strict, now they're casual. "So where are you headed after this?" People get confused because they think the stop was already about to end. But officers sometimes shift tone intentionally to observe whether your behavior changes too. Nervous people often relax prematurely and start talking more freely. That's why consistency matters so much during stops. Not robotic consistency, human consistency. If your story changes dramatically after pressure decreases, Officers notice. Now here's the important mistake I hinted at earlier, and this one catches people constantly during school zone stops. Trying to minimize dangerous behavior instead of acknowledging it calmly. That sounds backwards, but hear me out. When drivers say things like, "It wasn't even that bad, no kids were around, I barely crossed the line, I was only on my phone for 1 second," officers often hear denial of risk rather than acceptance of responsibility. And that matters because school zone enforcement revolves around prevention. The officer is thinking about what could have happened, not only what did happen. Ironically, drivers who calmly acknowledge poor judgment without becoming defensive often experience smoother interactions than drivers who aggressively minimize obvious conduct. That doesn't mean confess to crimes unnecessarily. It means understand the psychology involved. There's a difference between calm acknowledgement and argumentative minimization. Officers deal with excuses all day, recycled excuses, predictable excuses. The parent who says, "Everybody else was doing it too," doesn't sound unique to them. That sounds like the 20th person this month trying to normalize unsafe behavior. And normalization is exactly what school zone enforcement tries to fight. Because dangerous traffic culture develops slowly. One parent stops illegally, then another copies it, then 10 more follow. Eventually, the violation feels socially acceptable because it became common. Police departments know this. That's why some schools suddenly experience heavy enforcement after years of lax enforcement. Complaints increase, near misses increase. School administrators pressure local departments. Then officers arrive aggressively for 2 weeks straight and parents act shocked. But from law enforcement's perspective, they're trying to reset behavior patterns before somebody gets injured. Now let's talk about being asked to step out of the vehicle, because this moment changes the emotional temperature immediately. A parent gets pulled over near a school. Officer talks for several minutes. Then suddenly, "Go ahead and step out for me." Most people's heart rate spikes instantly. They think arrest, they think search, they think disaster. But legally, officers in the United States generally have broad authority during lawful traffic stops to order drivers out of vehicles for safety reasons. Courts have repeatedly supported this principle. That doesn't automatically mean you're being arrested, but perception matters. And the roadside environment suddenly feels very different once you're standing outside your vehicle while traffic passes by and parents stare from nearby cars. Officers know stepping someone out changes psychological control. People become more compliant outside the vehicle because the environment feels more vulnerable. And officers may use this when they believe tension inside the vehicle is increasing. Maybe your passenger keeps interrupting. Maybe your movements concern them. Maybe they suspect distraction, impairment, or concealed items. Or maybe they simply want clearer communication away from children inside the vehicle. Again, context matters enormously. Now let's discuss inspection behavior that drivers find strange. An officer shines a flashlight into the rear floorboard in broad daylight. They crouch slightly while approaching. They glance repeatedly toward cup holders. They look through windows before speaking. Drivers often interpret this as searching without permission. But visually observing areas in plain view from lawful vantage points is generally different from physically searching the vehicle. Officers are trained observers. They're looking for open alcohol containers, drugs, weapons, suspicious movements, phones in active use, signs of impairment, or evidence contradicting statements. And school zone stops increase sensitivity because impaired or distracted driving near schools is viewed extremely seriously. People forget officers are constantly building narratives in their heads during stops. Does the driver match the violation observed? Does behavior align with explanations? Do passengers appear nervous? Is there urgency or unusual tension? Are there indicators of concealment? Every interaction becomes a puzzle assembled in real time. Now here's another uncomfortable truth. Many drivers accidentally talk themselves into citations they probably would not have received otherwise, especially when ego enters the conversation. The stop starts manageable. Then the driver decides they need to win. That mentality destroys otherwise salvageable encounters. Because traffic stops are not courtroom debates. They're roadside investigations conducted under time pressure, uncertainty, and emotional stress. The officer controls the environment initially. Challenging that emotionally rarely works out the way people imagine. And school zone stops carry an added moral dimension. Officers know the public generally supports child safety enforcement. So drivers who become combative over school-related violations often receive less sympathy than they expect. Now, does that mean officers are always correct? Absolutely not. Some officers overreach, some escalate unnecessarily, some become rude, dismissive, impatient, or aggressive. Some misinterpret nervousness. Some treat ordinary parents like criminal suspects. That happens, and body cam footage proves it happens. But even when officers behave poorly, drivers still make strategic mistakes by reacting emotionally instead of carefully. People underestimate how much emotional self-control matters during police encounters. One sarcastic sentence can change the atmosphere instantly. One angry movement can create unnecessary fear. One impulsive admission can permanently affect a case later. And one small lie can destroy credibility completely. That last part matters more than people think. Minor dishonesty during traffic stops causes massive problems, because once officers catch even a tiny inconsistency, everything else becomes suspicious. You say you weren't on your phone. Officer already saw it in your hand. Now every statement afterward loses credibility. You say you've never been through that school zone before. Officer learns your child attends the school daily. Again, credibility damage. And once officers believe you're intentionally deceptive, the interaction often becomes much more investigative. That's why nervous improvisation is dangerous. People panic and start inventing explanations they haven't thought through. Silence feels uncomfortable, so they fill gaps with unnecessary talking. Then contradictions appear. Now let's touch on recording police during traffic stops, because this comes up constantly in body cam discussions. Many drivers record now. Officers know this. Most departments know this. And while laws vary by state regarding specific recording circumstances, openly recording from your vehicle during a lawful stop is generally protected in many situations, as long as you're not physically interfering. But here's where people misunderstand reality again. Recording does not magically improve behavior from either side. Sometimes it calms interactions. Sometimes it escalates performative behavior from everyone involved. Drivers start narrating dramatically for an online audience. Officers become more rigid because they know footage may circulate publicly. And the stop transforms from communication into mutual image management. That rarely improves outcomes. The most effective drivers during stressful stops usually project calm predictability, not fear, not arrogance, not fake legal expertise from social media clips. Predictability. Officers constantly assess whether a stop is staying stable or becoming unstable. Calm, predictable behavior lowers uncertainty. Abrupt emotional swings increase it. And school environments amplify all of this because distractions are everywhere. Kids screaming, parents honking, crosswalk activity, school staff signaling traffic, buses moving, teen drivers nearby. Officers are processing all of it simultaneously. Which brings me to something many viewers never think about. Officers themselves often feel pressure during school zone enforcement because one missed danger can become headline news. If an officer ignores reckless behavior near a school and the child later gets hurt, scrutiny comes fast. Departments know this. Communities know this. So officers sometimes overcorrect by becoming hyper-aggressive about violations that drivers consider minor. Again, perspective clash. Drivers see inconvenience. Officers see liability, risk, and worst-case scenarios. Now imagine this situation. You're late for work. Your child is upset in the back seat. The drop-off line is backed up into the street. You quickly pull into a restricted zone for 30 seconds because you think you're helping traffic move. Blue lights activate. Immediately your stress level spikes. Your child asks, "Are you getting arrested?" Cars crawl past watching. The officer approaches slowly. "License and registration." You explain immediately. Officer says nothing. Walks back to patrol car. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Another officer arrives. Now your brain starts racing. That emotional spiral causes people to make terrible decisions. They become impatient. They step out unexpectedly. They start filming aggressively. They interrupt. They challenge authority emotionally instead of strategically. And suddenly the stop that could have ended quietly becomes memorable for all the wrong reasons. That's why understanding traffic stop psychology matters just as much as understanding the law itself. Because roadside encounters are emotional pressure tests, not just legal events. And school zone stops are even more emotionally loaded, because everybody involved thinks they're protecting children in some way. The parent thinks they're helping their child. The officer thinks they're protecting all children. The crossing guard thinks drivers ignore safety. The school administrator thinks parents are impatient. Everybody enters the situation believing they're the responsible one. That tension creates conflict before anyone even speaks. One final thing people need to understand about bodycam footage from school zone stops. Viewers watching later usually see things more clearly than the people involved in the moment. On video, it's easy to say, "Why didn't the driver just stay calm?" But adrenaline changes perception. Authority pressure changes perception. Public embarrassment changes perception. And once emotions rise, people stop thinking strategically. That's when little mistakes become expensive ones. A careless sentence, an impulsive gesture, a sarcastic remark, an unnecessary lie, a refusal delivered with attitude instead of composure. Those tiny moments often shape the entire outcome more than the original traffic violation itself. And the next time you're sitting in one of those chaotic school drop-off lines, watching parents invent their own traffic rules because they're in a hurry, pay attention to how quickly normal behavior starts feeling acceptable when enough people are doing it. That's usually the exact moment blue lights appear behind somebody who never thought they'd be the one getting stopped.